Ella would like to join the taste of.
She's welcome. She's clearly tasting something.
She's tasting chocolate cheesecake. She took it right out of my hand.
It's Carlos.
Can you see that if I look framed in that?
Yeah. Maybe tilt it more
A little
up.
higher?
Yeah. It's cutting off the top of your head.
Well, that's not bad. That's
That looks better.
better. Higher still?
No.
Okay.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
You're right with y'all.
The numbers coming in on day two. Wow. Good reminder.
That's by the way.
Kristen. Nice to meet you.
Don't do that anymore.
What's the highlight for you for last week?
All right, good. I got it. So I'm going to pass out a handout that hopefully will be helpful for just reference for tonight. Again, am I still framed in this?
Yeah.
Okay, now you're all looking at the camera. So we'll wait a few minutes as people still come in, but welcome back. I see I scared some people away. Maybe it didn't taste so good, the taste of Judaism. But I do want to just start with answering any questions that you might have been thinking about since our last class. If you remember, Last time we were together, we were talking about God and Jewish theology a bit, which is, I'll admit, a tricky way to start this class because those are rather heady concepts. But any questions, anything you thought about, anything that you went home and like, that makes no sense, or whatever, just anything you want to ask about. Please.
I was just saying, we were fortunate enough to be back here on Saturday for our daughter's bat mitzvah, and I must admit I was sitting before the service started, still saying to myself, so you could be Jewish and not believe in God, okay? As my wife would say, I haven't been able to get that out of my head. But there was one thing that struck me in that service, two things actually. One, it's the first time I've been to a service in a synagogue, and I made the observation that it must have felt like what it was like in the Catholic Church before they switched from Latin. So when you don't understand anything, it's hard to follow, but I found in the book of service there were English explanations at the bottom. And I was struck by how similar a lot of it felt to like the Anglican Church of Canada, where I've spent a lot of time. And not all of it, but there were, and I don't know why that surprised me, but I did notice that.
Yeah. So I had a professor once when I was in seminary who was explaining the evolution of religion in general, not any specific religion. And he said, if you're going to make a new religion, you want to make it look like a religion. So you want to make it like the ones that are around, or that came before, so people can identify it as a religion, but still different enough that you can attract people to your way of thinking. So, this, if Judaism was, at least through Western religions, the start of the whole thing, then the fact that there are similarities in other religions that you can trace back to Judaism, and us being a Hebrew Bible, Old Testament tradition, would make a lot of sense, I think. Just to follow along those same lines. And you're right, that so most of the people in our congregation do not speak Hebrew. Many of them can vocalize Hebrew and will have a key word vocabulary, so they'll recognize the word Shabbat, they'll recognize the word Kadosh or Adonai or Ahavta, whatever it is, but they don't speak fluent Hebrew. The prayers in that case often serve more as a folkway or a mantra. They trigger something inside of them because they've heard it so often, and maybe they've heard the rabbi or the cantor explain the theme of that prayer, so they know what that's about, but they are not translated word for word. In fact, one of my greatest theological crises was when I learned to speak Hebrew fluently when I was in seminary in Israel, in Jerusalem. And then I'm reading these prayers, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's not how I would choose to say that. I'm not sure I'm fully on board with that kind of language, And still, we've kept the words largely unchanged, at least generationally. Updates have been made for inclusion of gender and just inclusivity in general. Because it has this folkway to it, because it triggers something in a positive way inside of people, and the melody is an important part of that also. We change melodies far more often than we change the words, and for many people you think that we've changed the words because the melody is so different. And when we read the English, I find it wanting, I find it limiting. In some ways, not knowing what the words exactly say is more expansive. I can attribute to that prayer about love, or that prayer about relationship, or that prayer about the environment, sort of my own take on it, as opposed to being limited to this is what it says.
So there's kind of a mystery about it, because you don't understand it.
Yeah, I'm not sure mystery, I wouldn't say mystery, I would say a creativity, perhaps? Yeah. So, any other questions from last week, or any things that were from around? So we have a new student that wasn't with us last week. So what we did is we introduced ourselves in sort of a "Why are you here?" kind of statement. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Everyone, I'm Christina, and I am learning more about Judaism and thinking about conversion.
Great. We're glad you're here, Christine. Anybody else that wasn't here last week? Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Juan, and always I have feelings.
Come on, you guys. You want to close those doors as you come in, just so we block out the noise a bit?
I think we talked about the Jewish Jewish people because I can feel the tenacity and commitment to my society. So yeah, I'm here for that.
Great. I think everybody else was here last week. You all look familiar. Okay, so tonight we're going to do what I'll loosely call Jewish literacy. I'm going to try to explain Jewish texts and Jewish traditions. A little bit about holidays, a little bit about ritual, probably sort of a lot about structure. And I hope that the PowerPoint will be sort of helpful as we go through. I can send you all, because I have your email, a copy of the PowerPoint. For those that are watching online, I don't have the fancy camera tonight, so I can't show you the PowerPoint as I'm doing it, and I'm sorry for that. So let's start with Hebrew, as we were just talking about. So Hebrew is written from right to left, which makes sense if you're chiseling and you're mostly right-handed. I've never actually chiseled a letter before, right? But if you're right-handed, you know, you're going from right to left. It's easier for a right-handed person to chisel this way than it is to chisel that way because you're trying to write this way, right? Yes, you're trying to write this way, so you want it unfolding in front of you, I guess. The words are written without vowels. The letters, I should say, are written without vowels. And I think as I showed you on the screen last time, there's consonants and there's vowels. The vowels are largely dots and dashes that are often below the text. I think I have an example of that before. So here's how the Hebrew looks inside the Torah itself. So that scroll that we read from, which we refer to as the Torah or the Hebrew Bible, you might have grown up referring to it as the Old Testament. This is the very first sentences of the book of Genesis. And it's written with a quill and ink by hand. A Torah scroll itself has to be written on with all natural elements to it. It has to be written by hand. It's written on parchment. Usually it has to be the skin of a kosher animal, often deer skin or calf skin, lamb skin as well. And here you can see letters that there are some flourishes to them. You might see some dots and lines that are coming out. Those are little crowns, but that actually doesn't have any vocalization to it. This is exactly what it looks like in the Torah. You'll see that letter, that first letter on the screen here is the Hebrew letter bet. And if you know anything about the Hebrew alphabet, like the English alphabet, begins with an aleph or an A. Bet, or B, which is this letter here, is the second letter of the alphabet. And there's a whole story about why the letter Bet, the second letter of the alphabet, was chosen to begin the Torah as opposed to the first letter of the alphabet. And this is a mystical tale, and it gives a lot of anthropomorphic ideas to the notion that these letters have feelings and those whole things. But one of the explanations, which again comes from the mystics or the Kabbalists, is that because the bet is closed on the top, closed behind, and closed on the bottom, we shouldn't worry about what came before or what came above, but everything that flows from this. So if we're reading, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and God said, let there be light and all those things, and we know about evolution, and we know that the world is older than 5,783 years, which is how Jews are counting the Torah, or counting the days from Torah, beginning of creation. I'm just going to move this back so I can see it. Or not. We could get lost in the whole, well, this doesn't jive with that. And again, back to what I was talking about before, I don't read the Torah or the Hebrew Bible as a history book or a science book. But if we just want to say, well, let's start from this story. Not for the sake of history or the sake of science, but for the sake of understanding. And we can begin there. And so the bet was chosen because it's open. It's closed off to the things that could be distracting, and everything flows from this, bracket, if you would. So this should have been my iPad doesn't do Hebrew, so that should have shown you the bet. Why begin with this letter? To teach that you can't ask what happened before, above, or after. It's not that you can't ask, but that the focus is on what flows. The other is that I should mention that there are two Torahs in Judaism. There's the written Torah, the one that we showed here, and this is described both on the glossary sheet that's on your page and also on the back there's a chart. And if you don't have, there should be some extras on your table. If not, here you go. But in Judaism we have the written law. Both of these end up being written, but we have the written law and we have what's called the oral law. So the written law is the Torah and what we would call the Hebrew Bible, so that includes the writings and the prophets. So you've got books like Joshua and Jeremiah and Isaiah, those are prophets, and Kings and Chronicles, those are the writings. That's the written Torah, that's the canon of Jewish text, the written text. But there was also an oral tradition. And that is what we now know as rabbinic text. You can, oh, is there something there? Okay. That's now what we know as sort of the rabbinic tradition, which according to the way that we teach these things, one explanation is that when Moses went up on Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, Moses wrote it down during the day. And at night, while Moses slept, God whispered into Moses' ears the oral tradition. It's a lovely tale. It might be true. The more, I think, rational explanation is that after this written text was developed, there was a whole new school of thought, which is how do you apply that text? How do you, if it says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, what does that mean in practicality? And from that, I think I used this reference last time, from that you get don't eat a cheeseburger or a pepperoni pizza. Because what does it mean to boil a kid in its mother's milk? Well, that means the separation of milk and meat. And then all the rules about what constitutes separation and what isn't and how much and all those things. That is the oral tradition, and we loosely call that the Talmud. We'll get into that in a little more detail in a moment. So those are sort of, I don't want to say two Torahs. It's all one Torah, but as we get into commandments, they are located in two places. So let's just talk for a moment about translation. So many of us grew up reading the King James Bible, the one that they left in the nightstand at the hotel or whatever it was, and you look at that, and oftentimes in non-Jewish, we'll say Christian Bible study, you'll sit and you'll argue over, well, it says this, right? It says a virgin birth or whatever it was. There is no official translation in Judaism. One of my teachers in seminary taught all translation is commentary. So any time that you try to say, well, this in the original actually means this in your language, you're making a choice. And when you're doing that, you're adding your own layer, your own lens to it. So in Judaism, we'll argue over the language, but the purpose of the argument is not to, I should say the purpose of the argument is to get to the truth. We talked about that last time. And you can't argue over an English translation. You can only really argue over how you understand the Hebrew. And Hebrew is a fairly limited vocabulary, so many words can kind of swing both ways or in multiple directions, and it can be impacted by the other words around it. The first two words of the Bible present a grammatical problem. That code right there means nothing to you, because again, my Hebrew font isn't showing up. But it says, Bereshit bara. In the beginning, God spoke. Bereshit bara, and the next word is Elohim. And the challenge there, Bereshit bara Elohim, is often translated as in the beginning God created. But if we wanted to say in the beginning God created, we would actually write it as Bereshonah, in the very first part. And now I'm getting into Hebrew grammar that I know is confusing. Bereshit is only half of the expression. Hebrew grammar requires that the next word be a noun, but in fact the next word is a verb, spoke. In the beginning, God spoke or God created. Bara actually is to create by speaking. And so one of these Torah rabbi commentators, his name is Rashi, teaches that God was teaching us that we don't just translate, we must interpret. So when do you create by speaking, if ever? Do you ever create anything by speaking? Yeah.
Okay, ChatGPT.
Prior to ChatGPT.
When you ask somebody to do something for you,
Mm-hmm.
and you're asking them to translate what you're saying into an action of doing for you.
Right. Okay, so that's a pretty power move, right? To be able to tell somebody, I do this with my kids all the time, to be able to tell them to do something and then they do it. And in some ways that is sort of a godly thing, right? You can only do that in a power relationship. I can do it with maybe my employees to an extent. I can do it with my children to an extent. I better not try to do it with my wife, right? So when God is one of those unique things, again, whether you believe in God or not, in the system that Judaism has, that God can create just by speaking, just by word. And in fact, God can command things that are not, sentient beings to do things. God commands the sun. God commands the waters to separate. Commands the earth to bring forth food. No human being gets to do that. We create by doing. God creates by speaking. Even when we try to create by speaking, it requires somebody to do the doing. So right there we have sort of some evidence of the specialness of God in Jewish theology, that God creates by speaking. And I think that God put this lesson here between words 1 and 2 so that those of us with ADD, won't miss it, right? That you got to kind of stop and you got to catch what's going on here. The world was created because God said, "Let there be light. Let there be a world." And that's a unique thing to God. We can't do that. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, of blessed memory, he was the chief rabbi of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom, wrote in his book, Not in God's Name, every text needs interpretation. Every interpretation needs wisdom. Every wisdom needs careful negotiation between the timeless and time. Fundamentalism reads texts as if God were as simple as we are, and that's unlikely to be true. The Talmud says one who translates a verse literally is a liar. The Talmud being those rabbinic texts. Help me and help each other understand what Rabbi Sacks is saying there. What do you take from that? Yeah.
Maybe that first being interpretation, and then there's an experiential part of sort of developing that wisdom or knowing, and then you see it in a different way, and you can probably see it in many different ways over time.
Right, interpretation without knowledge is kind of frivolous, right? So when Jews study the Bible, we do a process called exegesis, as opposed to Christian study, which is eisegesis. So Christian Bible study, this is why I can't study the Bible with non-Jews. Not because I don't want to, but because we're looking at it from two different lenses. Eisegesis is to come with an agenda, looking for evidence in the text. Jesus was the Messiah. Let me find evidence of that in the text. Exegesis is to extract meaning from the text. This text is saying that Abraham sacrificed his son but then held back the knife. What does that mean? When the angel calls out to Abraham 2 times, Hineni, or Abraham, and Abraham responds, Hineni, here I am. What does that mean? What can I learn from that? From that repetition, from that moment, from that response? Where else is Hineni said in the Torah? That particular word that means I hear you and here I am. And when Jews read the Bible, we don't just say, well, this is what I think it means. We actually go, this is why we're called the people of the book. It should be plural. We go back to all of these other layers of interpretation and commentary and scholarship to see what others have seen this to mean over time. And even then we argue with them because they don't all agree with each other. And so the Jewish process of study is really a deep dive into, it's down that rabbit hole of Google research, but it's not Google, where it's not about what you bring to it. That's at the very, very end. It's really about what you find in it through all of these different lenses. Questions about that? Yeah.
I just have a question about your process, that if somebody came to you for spiritual guidance and they have some sort of an issue, like, is this something that you just sort of would counsel them on based on your knowledge? Would you go and look in the book for evidence, come back to them? Like, how does that usually work?
So in a counseling session, people come to me for all, why me? I don't know. But, for all sorts of things, parenting their children, dealing with end-of-life decisions, all those kinds of things. One of the things that I hope a rabbi can do is to have a fluidity of a knowledge of those texts. I don't have to take a book off my shelf and say, look here, but to rather do as I'm doing with you and translate those concepts in in a true and way with integrity, but but it's not me speaking it. I rarely say to somebody, I think you should do this. I will often say to people, our tradition teaches that this is the value that you want to consider. That, there is this story in our tradition that I think is relevant to this, and therefore you might want to consider that. Just picking off the top of my head, I was counseling somebody recently about their infertility, and they were just tremendously frustrated with it. And so we talked about Torah, and I began with my thing. It's not a history book, I use that all the time. I said, but look, we have stories in there of women that struggled for a very, very long time. And then ultimately they had a child. And they stayed with it, they tried all sorts of things. There's, biblical versions of surrogacy and those kinds of things. And so your struggle is not new, and it's not hopeless. And we have the advantages now of all of this science and technology, and we have resources of our community to bring to bear. You're not alone in this. You can trace your challenges all the way back to Sarah, Abraham's spouse. To the extent that was comforting to them, we talked about the value of it in that particular session. We had a conversation about both surrogacy and adoption, and how both are totally kosher in Judaism and considered mitzvahs. In fact, maybe a greater mitzvah than having a child yourself, to give a child that is parentless a home, to give somebody who has the ability to bear children the opportunity to do it again for someone else. So that's how we would have that conversation. And usually you leave with something to read from my office. I give you a pen. Okay, so, and this is sort of, I should have probably used the same chart, but it's similar. It's just what I found on my phone, or my computer. So this is the back of this page will kind of follow this. So let's sort of figure out the structure of Jewish texts, right? The canon of Jewish texts. So we have the Bible, which is, in Hebrew we call it Tanakh, and that's on your glossary sheet, I'm pretty sure. Yes, the first one. And it's an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, which is prophets, and Ketuvim, which is writings. So those are the 5 books of Moses, and then all the other books of the Old Testament, for the most part. There's a few other books that are in another group of texts that are apocryphal, but we'll leave those out for a moment. So those texts are considered sacred texts by fundamentalists or traditionalists, the Word of God. We talked about that a little bit last week, and we'll talk about it more in a moment. Then we have the development of the Talmud, which contains the Mishnah. That's the oral law. That was the thing that was whispered to Moses at nighttime. It's the how-to manual for Torah. It says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. This is how to avoid doing that. Within the Talmud itself, you have the Mishnah, which serves as sort of the literal how-to. And then you have a debate over the how-to, which is recorded in this collection of rabbinic texts called the Talmud. So this is sort of case law, and I'm not a lawyer, and all the arguments, all the evidentiary arguments that go into it. So you have actually 2, that's called Gemara, and there's actually 2 different versions, because there are 2 different communities that were doing this. There was the community in Jerusalem, so the community that remained in the land of Israel after the destruction of the Second Temple, so the year 70 forward. And then you have the group that was in exile outside, called the Babylonian Talmud, which is generally the one that we use. These communities were in communication with each other, and in remarkable ways, they managed to blend their texts so that they were in dialogue with each other over hundreds of years, really about 600 years of the development from the codification of the Mishnah in the year 200, so the actual writing of the Mishnah, to the codification of the Talmud, sort of the closing of the book. And everything else was written in the outside margins. I'll show you a page in a moment. Over those 600 years, without the internet, without texting or WhatsApp, they were in dialogue with each other. And one of the ways we read this is that these were conversations that happened with nobody in the same room. They happened over generations. But you would always cite who taught you that. It's a concept in Judaism that is probably important for us to use in days of ChatGPT, which is, I say this in the name of somebody else who said it. Cite your sources. Very important in Judaism. You can always add your own, but who you're citing is critical to the weight of your argument. So building on that, and this gets very confusing, as I said, in the year 800, that inner box is closed off. No more development of law. So now we have commentaries on this, and some commentaries on this. Largely, though, commentaries on this, as the great minds of Jewish thought, people like Rashi and Maimonides, you might have heard those names before, Joseph Caro, try to explain what the rabbis were talking about, try to get to the essence of it. Because one of the things the Talmud doesn't do very well is tell you the answer. It has far more questions or far more open-ended things than it does conclusions. We use our analogies we've been using about separating milk and meat. Well, in this instance you do, in this instance you don't. This rabbi followed this practice, this rabbi followed that practice. The majority followed this rabbi, but what about the minority? That means that some were still doing the minority opinion. And one of the very important things in Judaism, as it is in constitutional law in the United States, which I studied a little bit, is to record the minority opinion. Because at some point the minority, right now it's record, God willing, the minority might become the rule of law. And so you record that argument. Nothing is thrown away in that regard. And then there are some other categories of text. So you might have heard of Kabbalah. Used to be, I could reference Madonna and Roseanne Barr. I still can. So 13th century, so far later than the 8th century, 9th century. That's a mystical text, and you might have even heard that you're not supposed to study the Kabbalah until you're 40 because for all sorts of reasons. Sorry?
You don't have enough life experience.
You don't have a life, so that's the best answer, is you don't have enough life experience to understand it. So this is finding hidden messages within the text. I'm not really a Kabbalist. Some of the stuff, like the thing with the letter, it's cute. And if it gets you there and it helps you understand, it's a lens. So people that only study the Kabbalah and don't study the rest of this are eating only the icing and not the cake. Right? It's sweet, it's interesting, but it has none of the, not the cake has any nourishment in it, but it has none of the essence. It's frivolous to just study that without using it as a lens for something. It's not a lens unto itself. Similarly, there's something called Midrash. And I think I might have shared one with you just a moment ago, I don't remember. But Midrash is Jewish folktale. It is not legal or legalistic in its approach, but it's there to illuminate an idea. I'm from the United States, so I've used this reference for 20 years. Forgive me for this. But I would often ask my students, what do you know about George Washington? And even in a group of Canadians, I think I can probably ask that question. What do you know about George Washington?
Cherry tree.
Cherry tree. What do you know about the cherry tree story?
He chopped it down.
And why? We don't know why. But right, we don't know why,
But he
right?
admitted it.
But he admitted it, and what did he say to his mother? I cannot tell a lie. It was I who cut down that cherry tree. And we learn from that what?
Take responsibility for your actions.
George Washington was an honest guy, right? Slave
Sort of.
owner and had wooden teeth and all those things. But we also learn from that he was an honest guy. That's a midrash. It's a story, factually, doesn't really matter. It's there to illuminate the essence. One of my teachers called it literature about literature. Midrash is fun. Midrash is still written today. A lot of this other stuff we can't write today because it's been closed off, but Midrash is still being written in this moment. Things I've said to you, you could consider, if somebody would ever repeat them, not that they're worth repeating, could be a Midrash, attributed to Rabbi Moskovitz who did this. I'll give you an example. This one actually does get repeated. So during the height of the Syrian refugee conflict, crisis, at Passover, and many of you have been to a Passover Seder, there's a plate in the middle of the table and it has all sorts of symbols on it. After reading the story of the little boy whose body had washed up on that beach in Turkey, I wrote a ritual that we should include a banana on our Seder plate. Because if you remember, his father would bring him home a banana every day after work, which was a delicacy in Syria where they were. And so as to connect it with that story, we should put a banana on our Seder plate, and there was a little bit of a blessing that came with it. That's a midrash. It's not exactly a biblical midrash, but it is trying to use symbols and story to illuminate a value. That's what midrash is. We're talking about the Torah scroll before. So in our synagogue, and if you've watched any of our services on a Saturday morning online, you've seen us open up the big doors of what's called the Ark, the Holy Ark, and we take out a scroll. It's covered in usually a linen wrap, a garment, if you would, and it has silver breastplates on it, and it's adorned in a very fancy way. There's reasons for that. I won't get into those. Come take the other class. But inside it is this scroll, and as I showed you before, it's written by hand. An interesting thing just to note, and here's another midrash, none of the letters touch. And our rabbis say there's a reason for that. A midrash is that each letter in the Torah represents a soul within the Jewish people, and every soul has to have a moment when it's alone before God. And so if they touched, you wouldn't have that moment. Is that why they don't touch? Probably not. Probably because if they touched, it'd be very hard to read. But what a lovely notion to illuminate that teaching or that value. Can we pause? Questions? Yeah.
I was wondering what kind of happened when the Talmud was closed? Like, what was the shift when it was kind of canonized?
So thank you for asking. So the last group to write in the Talmud were called the Amoraim. You don't need to remember this. You don't remember any of this. And the year 800, and they had determined that their students were not smart enough to continue to add to the text. This often happens, right? This is how you get traditionalists or literalists. Again, Supreme Court happens that way. They don't trust that the people coming after them are close enough connected to the source. They're too radical. They're interpreting too many crazy things. We're shutting them off. They're not as smart as our parents were. We are, but they're not, right? So that's what happened. And honestly, what happened is it broke Judaism. So it was really from that moment that Judaism created its own crisis, which was it stopped responding to modernity. So new things would develop, new technologies, even in the age, right? What do you do with electricity? We never thought of electricity, whatever, how many hundreds of years that was later. And so the rabbis would go back and look in the Talmud and say, well, electricity, it's a spark, it's fire, you're not allowed to make fire on the Sabbath. We're going to get to that in a second.
And you can't turn on your...
So therefore you can't turn on a light switch. Now, is turning on a light switch the same thing as rubbing two sticks together? I don't think so. But because they closed the book, I don't have the authority to change that. Well, I do, because I'm a Reform rabbi. So that's how you start to get the fracturing of Judaism. When everybody was trying to work off the same sheet of music, we had to compromise. We had to have difference of opinions. This community did this and this community did that, and that was all okay. Right? So Robert Frost, good fences make good neighbors, but sometimes you shouldn't have any fences. Good question. There are 6 orders of the Mishnah. So this is that oral law. So we go from 1 scroll to 6 large books. We'll talk more about how many books in the Talmud, but this is a page of Talmud. So here we have the Mishnah, and then usually there's a word that indicates the Gemara. So this center block is all we're really talking about when we're talking about Talmud. And we're talking about more than that, but this is the part that didn't change after the year 800. All of this was added after. And all of this is commentary on this. Different commentaries are in different locations. There are scholars of the Talmud, because these pages are the same and they're printed on both sides, an A side and a B side. Because this doesn't move around, there are scholars of the Talmud I wouldn't have believed this to be true if I didn't have a teacher like this, who you could take a volume of the Talmud and you could put a pin in any page and say how many pages it went through, and they could tell you which word it went through on 7, 8, 10 pages on both sides. That's how deeply this text is studied within Orthodoxy.
That's scary.
It is scary. So when we see black hat Orthodox Jews in Israel studying all day and all night, this is what they're studying. And they're doing it in what's called a yeshiva. And in fact, the Israeli government subsidizes their doing it. It's a big controversial, among many controversial things in Israel. It's a particularly so one. And they are trying to understand this text, trying to get to the truth of it, trying to understand.
Do they ever lose themselves and lose the whole point of what they're supposed to be doing?
I'm sure they do. And they also don't always practice what they read. For some, it's just an intellectual exercise. For others, they get completely lost in the fundamentalism of it and can't live in the real world. And probably all things in between. But the studying of the text is its own job in Judaism. And particularly since the establishment of the State of Israel, it's a subsidized job. The argument was made when the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 to Ben-Gurion. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, will defend the country with weapons, and we, the Orthodox Jews, of which there were only 15,000 at the time, and now there's 1 million, will defend it through study. We'll defend it through prayer. 15,000 Jews, kind of hard to argue with that. 1 million, that's a different story if they don't serve in the army. So that's one of the controversies that exists today. So here's a set of Talmud. So we went from 1 scroll to 6 orders of the Mishnah to 63 tractates, which can be more than 1 volume of the Talmud. A lot of books. You can put all of that on your iPad or your phone now. I honestly haven't bought a printed book in I don't know how long. Okay, so let's take a look at just a text from the Torah, from the Bible. So remember you're talking about, so it says this in the Torah, but what does that mean in practicality? So in the Bible, this is the commandment for the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Let me stop right there. What does that mean? It's a sentence. It's got 7 words in it, right? 8 words. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Help me understand that.
I mean, it could mean just go about your day, but remember this day's holy, but you could still do what you want. Or it's the Sabbath and you have to do other things because it is holy.
So now we're having a Talmudic discussion.
Oh, okay.
Now, this is what the rabbis do. This is how Jews study Torah, okay? What does it mean to remember? How should I remember? Do I need to write it down? Am I supposed to remember it through symbols and rituals? Do I remember it through words, through actions? Why would I ever forget it? What am I remembering? Am I remembering the first Sabbath? That God rested on the 7th day of creation? And remembering last week? Which one am I remembering? Why is remembering it so important? Where else are we told to remember things? Because we're later told in the Torah to remember the Exodus from Egypt, to remember what it was like to be slaves, to remember to care for the widow, the orphan, the stranger. There's all sorts of remembering. What's this concern that we're going to forget? And how do you not forget? Okay, you told me to remember. What structures do I need so I don't forget? You can see why I took 63 tractates. Only one of them deals with the Sabbath. What's a Sabbath? What's a day? When does a day start? When does a day end? In Judaism, a day starts when the sun goes down, and it ends not when the sun comes back up, when the sun goes down again. And there's 3 stars in the sky. How do you know when there's no light? How do you know when the sun goes down? If you don't have, your iPhone to tell you exactly when sunset is, how do you know when there's sunset? And then there's all sorts of tests. I can't see the person in front of me. There's 3 stars in the sky. Everybody else is, I can't read a piece of paper. That's darkness, whatever it is. What is hope?
Obviously, nobody had been to Alaska.
Right, yeah. And then there's the question of what if the sun never sets? Right? I mean, the Jews of Alaska, the frozen chosen, they asked that question.
I've actually been up there.
And the answer, by the way, anybody know the answer? So think like a rabbi for a moment. Not this rabbi, but a smart rabbi. What would be your answer? If the Jews of Alaska came to you, Rabbi, and they said, Rabbi, the sun never sets in our community. When should we observe the Sabbath? When does the day end and the night begin?
We could pick a time in another state where the sun did set.
So you pick the next closest Jewish community of size where the sun does set. And you follow that. Right, so Seattle or Vancouver, right? And you follow their time.
There's a 4-hour time difference, 3-hour.
Right, and they came up with this before the internet, right? So you had to have some communication with that community and know what the thing was. Pretty rational reason, way to do it, as opposed to saying, well, then we just don't observe the Sabbath. They find a way. So again, when we close the text, you stop being able to provide that answer. There's ways to do it still, but you can't fundamentally change anything. What's holy? What's it mean to keep? Right, so here we're looking at the English, but in Hebrew, that word is actually said twice. Right, it's said shamor v'zachor, keep and protect, keep and remember. Shamor is to guard. So really, keep is not the right word here. It's actually shamor, which is to guard. Guarding and keeping, they might have other connotations to them. This is why, again, no authoritative translation. Anyway, we can go on, and in fact, that's what our tradition does. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. You work for 6 days, not for 7 and not for 5. What is work? But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. Not just Jews, but the people within your community. Yeah.
But you still got to feed the cattle. You still have to take care of the birth. You still have to. So that's work.
Or are the things that you do for your own sustenance, for your own sustainability, not work?
Well, then you can turn on the oven and cook your food.
Thank you, Rabbi. Is there a way to do that without turning on the oven? Is there a way that you can feed yourself without having to spark a fire? Microwave. Yes. My mom said a microwave. Ashley.
Rabbi Brown said during the B'nai Mitzvah class that the categories of work you're not supposed to do, because it's very specific, all have to do with building the ark. Like when we had.
Yeah, I'm not sure you're remembering that exactly correctly. It's not the ark, it's the building of the temple.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Okay. So again, how do you define work? And so, and how does God define work? And here it is, which is the point that Ashley was just coming to. I knew I had the slide on it. So, what's work? Right? I might define work differently than you do. So the rabbis say, here's work, and it's the 39 labors that were used to build the temple. Now, is that the only work that exists? Of course not. But this is their reference point. And remember, these are the folks that existed after the destruction of the temple. So the temple existed for hundreds of years before it was destroyed. None of these folks ever did this stuff. This is how they understand what work was, because there's this structure and that must have been work to do it. And they have the story. And so what are they? The primary classes of work are 40 less 1. We count weird in Jewish texts. Sowing and plowing and reaping and binding sheaves and threshing and winnowing and cleansing crops and grinding and sifting. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Capturing a deer, slaughtering a deer, I would assume, or flaying or salting it, curing its hide, scraping it of its hair. I mean, these are all, I don't do any of those things. You know, I go down to, superstore and I don't buy deer, but whatever it is in a plastic wrap and I take it home. I didn't have to do anything. Carrying from one domain to another. These are the 40 primary labors less 1. If it's not on that list, maybe it's not work. Or if it's on that list, what's the modern version of that?
But what if some of those things, like creating and sewing stitches, is actually fun for you and not work?
Great point. So what if, sure, if you sew all day long, you're a seamstress or you're a costume designer, that's work. But if you spend most of your day working on a computer and you want to spend your Saturday, needle pointing and watching golf or something, that doesn't seem like work to me. So this is why I'm a Reformed Jew. So I once had a conversion student actually who was telling the story of his conversion, and he was saying that he's really embraced the Sabbath. And for him, the Sabbath is to do things that he can't normally do during the week with his family. That's how he celebrates. It's not about not doing, it's actually about doing. And with that is he doesn't do certain things that are part of work. So I think I might have used this example before. Like if I try not to do, it's not so successful because rabbis work on the Sabbath, but I try not to send work emails on Shabbat. But I'll use my computer on Shabbat. I'll sit and binge watch Netflix, after my Shabbos nap at 2 o'clock. I'll wake up at 3 and I'll watch a Netflix show and people know not to bother me. They still bother me. But that's not work to me. That's using technology in a way that's rejuvenating. So now we get a sense of this. This is how Jewish text works. I think the slide repeated twice. So I'm leaving that topic. You understand sort of how the Talmud and texts work? Questions? Okay, so moving on. Again, I'm not doing this in any way to pick on Christianity. I'm just recognizing, it says in the Torah, or the Talmud, Da lifnei mi'ata omed, know before whom you stand. As we said before, many of us, our reference point for religion is what we grew up with, and for some in this room, that's Christianity. So if I can use the two as a compare and contrast, it might help you understand Judaism, and maybe it'll help you understand Christianity. Not my field, not an expert in it anyway. The relationship between Christianity and modern Judaism, so we have biblical Judaism, the Old Testament. It's actually accepted by both Judaism and Christianity. It's a text that's relevant to both. And then we see this branch, right? So Rabbinic Judaism, that big event was the destruction of the Second Temple. That was the rupture, not the rapture, the rupture of everything they knew and understood. Pretty much, Judaism was practiced like it's written in the Bible until the destruction of the Second Temple. Clearly, there were, and this we do have archaeological evidence for, clearly there were murmurs of other ways to be Jewish.
The Essenes, the everything else.
Right, so you have the Sadducees and the Pharisees and all these folks that were trying, this is the intertestamental period as it was called later on, but trying different ways to approach God. Christianity was part of that. As I understand it, Jesus came, and according to Paul, to simplify the law, that people, Jews, were getting caught up in violating commandments they didn't understand. 613 times in the Torah it says do this or don't do that. Nobody can keep track of that. And they were tripping over themselves, and they would constantly feel like they were a sin. This is how I understand Christianity. And so Paul, Jesus according to Paul, simplified it and settled it down to the 10 Commandments, or just 2, to accept Jesus as Lord and Savior, and I think there's another one. So their text was this New Testament that was developed, and a messianism that Jesus came to absolve people of their sins. Judaism developed those rabbinic texts that we were talking about before. Let's dig into it deeper and figure out how to do this, not from a voice from heaven, but from our deep dive into the nitty-gritty of what we think God means here. Just 2 different approaches. History shows they were more successful. Certainly had better uptake. It's all about how you read and interpret sacred texts. Judaism is a religion of commandments. You've heard of bar mitzvah? Mitzvah is command. It's not a good deed. We sometimes translate it as good deed. Sometimes mitzvahs are good. Sometimes commandments they're good to do, but they're not good things to do. Right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Adultery is not a good deed. Not committing adultery is not a good deed. It's just not a thing you should do. Or murder, or whatever it is. By the way, it's murder, not kill. So a bar bat mitzvah is somebody who is at the age of 13, the age of majority, is now accountable for their actions, responsible for those commandments. I like to tell my students that if your life is a book, prior to 13, everything is written in pencil. You're a kid. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes as an adult too, but these mistakes don't follow you. You're learning. Totally fine. At 13, now you're accountable for your actions. Are you still going to make mistakes? Absolutely, but now you have to own them. You can't just walk away and say, I didn't know. Now they're on you. It's like if you drive a car and you get pulled over, the explanation to the cop is, I didn't know that was the law, is not going to get you out of the ticket. Well, it might, but it's not supposed to. So at 13 and older, you're responsible for your actions. Everything, if your life is a book, pencil prior to 13, ink from 13 forward. Not just 10 commandments, 613. Love thy neighbor, not eat pork, paying wages to day laborers each day. By the way, that particular mitzvah, so if you have somebody that works in your home, this has happened to us a couple of times. We have a housekeeper, and she only comes 2 times a week, and we only pay her every 2 weeks. And for one reason or another, we might have thought we were on the wrong week, and then we discovered, we didn't pay her. And she's so sweet, she never tells us. And when that has happened, and thank God it's only happened a couple of times, my wife and I both know this commandment. We get in our car and we drive to Roxy's house and we give her the money. Because you're not allowed to hold the wages overnight. You might be able to afford that, but somebody that's working in that kind of position probably can't. And may not feel like they have the power to say something because they're worried about losing their job, which, you know, we would sell a child before we would get rid of Roxy. So these commandments, which might seem old school and, you know, irrelevant, can actually have very important modern day applications for us. You know, think about it in your own life, or think about it in your own experience. If you do a gig job or something like that, and oh, I'll pay you later. I may not see them later. Who knows? 613, as I said, those are all found in the first 5 books of the Torah. The rabbis of the Talmud added thousands more. The mixing of milk and meat and all of the intricacies of that. How to kosher slaughter an animal. Lighting of Shabbat candles is not in the Torah. It's a later rabbinic convention. Remember we talked about how do you remember something? So the commandment to light Shabbat candles is directly connected to the commandment, remember the Sabbath day. You look at the candles, you remember it's Shabbat. That's why we light candles. So Jews are actually bound by all of these other commandments. Now the categories of commandments are sort of important for me to explain to you. So there are more in the Torah, of those 613, there are moral ethical commandments, and then there are ritual symbolic. A moral ethical commandment would be a commandment that society should develop on its own out of common sense if it wants to function. Not to steal, not to murder, not to take things that belong to others, including their spouse or whatever it is. Those kinds of things. Society should develop those anyways, might not always do so. All Jews are obligated to those commandments, whether you're Reform or Orthodox. The members of this congregation, I mean, everybody does what they do, but no Reform Jew should say, I'm Reform, I'm allowed to murder. It's not an option. Symbolic, ritual commandments, like not boiling a kid in its mother's milk, those are not commanded for common sense reasons. They're not commanded for any reason that we understand other than they're just commanded. Now, to do something because God said do it is reason enough in Judaism. But, and here's a distinction between Reform Judaism and, let's say, Orthodoxy, I would say to you as your rabbi, does it have meaning for you? Can we find meaning in it? Try it. Try keeping kosher. If it means nothing for you, if it gets in the way of your holiness, not gets in the way of your day, right? So we have to eat other things. But if it really is a block for you and prevents you from enjoying life, enjoying your family, eating in your parents' home, whatever it is, then you can set it aside. That's what I can say as a Reform Jew, not just as a Reform rabbi. Orthodox Jews can't say that because Orthodoxy is to maintain all of those things. So that's how we get into this distinction. So now we get into, I kind of knew where I was coming to. I haven't looked at the slideshow since last night. So Orthodoxy, these are the different movements of Judaism, the streams of Judaism. All Jewish law, unchanging and binding on all Jews. The Hasidic, the Chabad community, black hats, long coats, hair, women whose heads are covered, dressing modestly. That's that group that we're talking about. You may have Orthodox Jews that you've run into in your family, in your circles, and you know that they will have a very particular way of how they act and operate, and they'll make demands upon you so they don't violate those commandments. And you have to assess whether it's your responsibility to make sure that they can do Judaism as they want to do it, or it's they chose to live that way, and so while you don't want to put a stumbling block in front of them, it's also not for you to suddenly become an Orthodox Jew to accommodate their particular way of looking at it. That in itself is a conversation that happens all the time in what I do, and it can be fraught and testy. Conservative Jews, all Jewish law is binding on all Jews, but laws change with the times. An example, it's okay to drive to synagogue on the Sabbath. So the conservative movement said, okay, it says you shouldn't travel, shouldn't ride on the Sabbath if you saw The Great Lebowski, right? We don't roll on Shabbos. Please tell me you've seen The Great Lebowski. The Big Lebowski, not The Great Lebowski. If you haven't, you should. The Coen brothers. The conservative movement said, well, if you're driving to synagogue, greater that mitzvah. And there's examples, they would say, in the text of people that were allowed to travel so that they could get to a synagogue or something like that to do that. And so they generally have to justify their exceptions within the text. They might be taking the minority opinion, but that's how they get there. Reform Judaism, as I said, ethical laws are binding, but ritual laws, head coverings, kashrut, all those things should be studied. Each individual decides if he or she, they hear God's voice in that particular ritual. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who's an Orthodox rabbi, a modern Orthodox rabbi, he said, I don't care which movement you were affiliated with so long as you were ashamed of it. And I think there's, look, Jews use humor a lot, but I think there's so much wisdom in that statement. I am embarrassed by my Reform movement and colleagues all the time, and I'm still a Reformed Jew, and I wouldn't consider being anything else. So I hope that Orthodoxy feels the same way, that you can be self-critical. I think being self-critical is critically important. If I could say critical in two different ways. Judaism and Jesus. So actually, before I do that, just, whoops. Uh-oh.
Backwards.
Right, back one. Any questions about Jewish movements? You might have heard of some other movements. Maybe you want to ask about that. Yes.
I have one question. When you're like a freelancer, you work in the movie business. We work over a weekend.
Mm-hmm.
How
do you do that? Yeah. So it's a wonderful question. So, on one level, is your observance of Shabbat, if your observance of the Sabbath prevents somebody else from earning enough money to provide for their family, is that fair? Is that just? Right? Your need to not work on the Sabbath means that we can't shoot this film, and that means nobody gets paid for today, and that means so-and-so can't feed their children. I think one has to examine that and say if that's really what God wanted. Or are you working in the wrong industry? If you're working in an industry that doesn't allow you to observe the Sabbath, are you a slave to that industry? Just like a slave in Egypt was not allowed to have a Sabbath. You could argue both and probably more sides than that. If you came to me as your rabbi and said, Rabbi, I can't observe the Sabbath in the industry that I work in, but I love what I do and I can't afford to do something else and I'm old dog new tricks, can't do whatever, I would say, how can you make a Sabbath within what you do? How can you find some semblance of holy time? And if it's not Friday night to Saturday, can you make sure that one day a week you observe a Sabbath? And maybe it's Wednesday.
Another day.
It's not optimal because the Jewish world should observe it all at the same time. You can't be Jewish alone on a mountaintop. I mean, you can, but Judaism happens in the context of community. But if that's the best you can do for that period of time, not the rest of your life, but part of your life, I would say that's better than nothing.
It's only for a short time.
Right. Yeah, it's only for a short time.
Yeah.
But when it's not that, are you intentional about making sure that you've now restored those boundaries of the Sabbath in your life? Right? We have many congregants that, for one reason or another, aren't in town over the summer or COVID. They couldn't come to the synagogue. And now the question is, will you come back? Right? Coming to synagogue was important to you, and it was important to us in the community. It's just one aspect of being Jewish, is showing up at the synagogue. My congregation would tell you, I say all the time, it's not about how often you show up in the synagogue, but how often synagogue shows up in you. But showing up is important. So now when you can show up, do you? Or you're like, oh, thank God, I don't have to work anymore, now I can go to the beach. Well, what about your obligation to the community or to yourself? Other questions? Please.
I was just wondering about the difference between reform and renewal movements. I've heard that renewal is like neo-Hasidic, but I don't really know what that means.
Yeah, so renewal is a North American invention. It takes from all sources, so it takes from all streams. It's largely grounded in the environment and sort of naturalism. It's Kabbalistic in nature, so it's got a mystical underpinning to it. It will allow for more traditional practice, but it's not bound by that. So I would say that renewal has no boundaries, where reform has some. The other one you might have heard of is Reconstructionist. Reconstructionist Judaism is really interesting. It was developed in the 1920s by a rabbi named Mordechai Kaplan, who was a conservative rabbi. And Kaplan looked at the American society at the time, which was largely about joining clubs and democratic, and you had all these, fraternal organizations and the men's group and the Lions Club and the Rotary and all these other things. And he said, well, let's apply this same democratic model to a synagogue. Let's vote on everything. Want to keep kosher? It's not about whether God says to keep kosher or not. It's about what the community decides. So let's vote. We'll keep kosher or not keep kosher. And then let's vote on what kind of kosher we'll keep. And what that created was a very democratic institution, but it wasn't an institution that had any other institution like it. So your Reconstruction synagogue looked nothing like the Reconstruction synagogue next door or in the next neighborhood, because everybody was making up their own, we would say, making your own Shabbos, making your own rules for how you do things. But it was very egalitarian in that regard. An interesting experiment. Fundamentally, I actually think that most Jews are Reconstructionist Jews. We're voting on what we want to do and what we don't want to do, and oftentimes it's a vote of who else is in this with me, and that's how we'll do it. My congregation doesn't do things because I say they should do them. They do things because they agree to do them or not to do them. But they probably also don't do them because everybody else is doing them necessarily. It's more individualistic in Reform Judaism. Reconstructionist Judaism is communal in that regard. Other questions? How are we on time? We're good. Okay. Moving on. Why don't Jews accept Jesus as the Messiah? The question you were all wondering. I don't know if that's what Jesus looked like, by the way. Whoops.
Nobody does.
Going the wrong way again. Oops. How do I go back? Nope. Going the wrong way. Oh my gosh. Where's my... Oh my... There we go. There you go. Okay, we're not going to try to do that again. The word Messiah comes from the Hebrew Mashiach, which means anointed one. We do a bit of anointing in biblical Judaism. We anointed the priest with oil. We anoint an altar. It is to designate something as sacred or holy. Kings of Israel were anointed by pouring oil, and kings in Judaism were chosen by God. They became known to them became known to the people that this should be the king, David, Solomon, those folks. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek about 200 BCE, by the way, Jews refer to BC and BCE, before the Common Era and the Common Era, not BC and AD, before Christ and after, domino after death, for obvious reasons, BCE and CE. The Hebrew word Mashiach became the Greek Christos, and Christos gives rise to the English Christ. I honestly did not know that until I made this slide. So the Jewish understanding of Messiah. So as I think I mentioned in our first class, Judaism is not Messiah focused. We are not afterlife focused. We are not about the world to come, even though we have references to that in our tradition. Most of those references came far later, after Christianity developed, in that intertestamental period, when there was probably a public relations challenge going on. But the concept most Jews talk about is a messianic age. Now, I shouldn't say most Jews, because Chabad, particularly, ultra-Orthodox Jews, they have a strong streak of messianism, almost to I would say the point of scary, where they have really adopted this idea that God is going to anoint, not send down God's Son. The Messiah in Judaism is a human being, selected, made known to the people, but not divine in nature. Just a leader like Moses, that is going to lead the people towards a better world. But Messianism, Judaism is messy. It's different in the sense that let me see if it's on this slide. I'll wait. Hold on to that for a second. It's on the next slide. So the Messiah in Judaism is a political or military ruler like King David, fully human and only human, not part human, part godlike. Not God in any sense. Yes.
Nobody thought Jesus was, by the way, I'm just going from the Creed of Nicaea. Nobody actually, a good portion of Christianity, right up until 300 BC, CE, actually kind of thought he was human, period. And it was only at the Nicaeum that where they kind of locked everybody in a room, that there had to be one solution. He was either divine or not divine,
Uh-huh.
and that came up. So that's a human thing in that decision. It wasn't.
Makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. So, not connected with the redemption of sin. The redemption or the repair of sin is on human beings. Nobody can remove your sin from you except for you through doing the work of repair and repentance, which is not a great word in Hebrew. But nobody just takes your sin off of you. Sins against God, there is God forgives. Sins against others, God cannot forgive unless that person who offended forgives and you repair the wrong. This is a process called tshuva, which means actually to turn around. And you might have heard this term connected with Yom Kippur. It's actually, I think, I think there are many things about Judaism that are quite insightful and brilliant. This one works really well. So if you go to a Yom Kippur service, on the evening of Yom Kippur, you will come to a service called Kol Nidre. You might have heard this very operatic, beautiful prayer. Sometimes it's played with a cello. Barbra Streisand did a version. Neil Diamond did a version. Al Jolson did a version, the jazz singer. So the Kol Nidre prayer, Kol means all, Nidre means vows. And it's a prayer about the promises we make. And the prayer says, promises that you make between you and God, prayer will absolve you of those if you honestly bring your contrite soul to God and you say, I'm sorry. So what's a vow that you make between you and God? You're on an airplane, you're in turbulence, could be anything, right? I promise God I'll never eat a cheeseburger again. I promise God I will give all of my money to charity if you just land this plane, whatever it is, right? I promise I will stop doing this or that. And then you land and you're like, oh, thank God I don't have to keep that promise. We landed. Those promises, if you honestly bring your contrition to God and you say, I made it, I acknowledge I made it, I wasn't thinking straight at the time, or I had the best of intentions, but things got in the way, I'm sorry, you're absolved. But promises that you make between you and another person, vows that you make, I will be faithful, I will not steal, I will, not cheat on my taxes, or whatever it is, those broken vows are not forgiven until you've gone to the person that you've hurt, you've acknowledged it. There's a lot of 12-step in this, or a lot of 12-step came from this. You acknowledge that you've done wrong, you go to the person and you seek forgiveness from them. You seek forgiveness first. You ask, will you forgive me? This is what I've done, and I'm sorry. Do you forgive me for what I've done? They can forgive you or not forgive you. Then the next step is you have to repair the wrong that you did. So you stole their car. You wrecked their car. Sorry, I wrecked your car. It was me that wrecked it. It wasn't your kid that, I blamed because, whatever it was. If you repair the wrong, I have to repair the car. Maybe with interest, maybe with a better car, I don't know, whatever it is. Then you're still not forgiven by God until that same situation comes up again and you don't repeat the offense. So infidelity is probably a better example, but I don't like to use that as an example. But so that's how it works in Judaism, and that's what the Kol Nidre prayer lays out on Yom Kippur. That's sin and an absolution from sin in Judaism, not a Messiah will remove the sins from you if you believe in them. You can see why Christianity had more followers. It's a lot easier the other way, and they don't have circumcision. And you can eat cheeseburgers. What?
Give it away.
Yeah. I mean, who wouldn't sign up for that, right? Messianism is not at the heart of Judaism. Jewish prophecies concerning the Messiah, a time of peace on earth. The Messiah will come only when we've created peace on earth. It's not the other way around. It's not the Messiah brings peace. And this is why we talk about a messianic age in Judaism as opposed to a Messiah. We have to do, this is where you hear the term tikkun olam. We have to fix all the brokenness in the world, and then a leader from amongst us will rise up and take us to the next place. And honestly, I think the best modern example of this is Martin Luther King, with all of his whatever problems and humanity and all that stuff. But that was that Martin Luther King was trying to resolve at least that issue, and war as well. And had we done that, had he been successful and we've been successful in following him, the next leader after Martin Luther King would have taken us to the next level. I mean, that's how, in my worldview, I wasn't alive during that time, but I see that in a messianic context. That's the kind of Messiah that we talk about in Judaism. And there can be multiples. I'm going to leave the rest of it. So here's the test in Judaism. For other than that, the Messiah has come. Read the New York Times or the Globe and Mail, cover to cover, every day for a month. If there is no story of war or hatred or hunger or disease, the Messianic age may be here. Until then, we still have work to do. And that's how Jews view the world. There's still work to do. And we're not praying for it, we're working for it. That's the chosenness in Judaism. Oh, look, I put a neat slide. I think we understand this. Hebrew calendar, I'll just do this fairly quickly. There's an app for that now. It's a very complicated calculation. Jewish calendar is a lunar solar calendar. So sometimes we refer to days as, or holidays as being early or late. They're only early or late in relation to the secular time of year. How close Rosh Hashanah is to the start of the school year or Labor Day or not. They're actually in the right time. The Jewish holidays are, it's the rest of the world that is moving around. But it's a very complicated thing. Fundamentally, Jewish holidays are observed in the same time and season that they occurred in the Bible and in the context of the land that they lived in, which was in Israel. So we have a harvest holiday, a fall harvest holiday in October, where we start praying for rain. You don't pray for rain in October in Vancouver, it's already raining. You don't want to live in a hut, which is part of that holiday of Sukkot in October in Vancouver, because it's already raining on you. You can live in a hut in October in Israel. It's actually quite pleasant. So those kinds of things. These are the major Jewish holidays. I'll just mention that Thursday night and Friday is a Jewish holiday that some of you probably have not heard of called Shavuot. Shavuot is the holiday where we celebrate the receiving of Torah. So we have been counting the days from the Exodus from Egypt, Passover, to this holiday of Shavuot, of which there are 49 days in between. And Jews have been on this metaphysical journey to receive Torah, which we will arrive at Mount Sinai tomorrow night. Questions about any of the holidays on this list? Things you want to know about them? Hanukkah is not the Jewish Christmas. Nothing to do with Christmas. Tisha B'Av is Jewish Arbor Day. It's our holiday for trees, it is. So in Judaism we have a number of New Years, and it's the cycle of trees. So what you're not supposed to prune your tree, your fruit tree, for 3 years after it bears fruit, and then 3 years after it bears fruit, then you can start to take the fruit. Otherwise, you just have to let it do its natural thing. And what's a year for a tree? It's from one Tu B'Shvat to the next. So you might have planted it at a different time, but that's the cycle.
Purim's a party.
Yeah. So Purim is a sort of the Jewish masquerade ball, if you would. And it commemorates the story of Esther and the near destruction of the Jewish people at the hands of Haman, who was an evil dude one of those evil dudes throughout history tried to kill the Jews. There's a number of them. Other questions? Oh, sorry, you asked about Tisha B'Av, not Tu B'Shvat. Sorry, I didn't listen to everything you said. So Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is the day that was the destruction, again, not reading the Bible as a history book, the day of the destruction of the first and the second temple in Jerusalem happened both on the 9th of Av. They probably didn't, but they might have happened around the same time. Happens in the summer, usually when kids are at Jewish summer camp, and it's a day of fasting and mourning for all of the calamities that have befallen the Jewish people, except the Shoah, the Holocaust. The whole debate was had about whether we should just put the Holocaust Commemoration Day on Tisha B'Av, and this is after the State of Israel was established, and it was determined at that time that no, it is sui generis, at least for the time being, amongst the Jewish people. It needs its own day of commemoration. 1,000 years from now, will it move onto Tisha B'Av? God willing, we're still here 1,000 years from now, and they can have that conversation. And it hasn't happened again. Neat graph, kind of tells you the cycle of things. We're almost done. So Passover, Sukkot, that's the hut that we build for harvesting. You're supposed to dwell in the sukkah. You're supposed to have a meal in it. Some Jews will make a sukkah at their home. Most synagogues have one as well. The way you dwell in a sukkah is to have a meal in it. But you're also permitted to and encouraged to sleep in the sukkah. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, that's the shofar, the horn that's used to announce the new year, blasting the shofar. Apples and honey for a sweet new year. Apples are round. Cycle of the year. Pomegranates have 613 seeds in them, one for each commandment. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, that's the process of tshuva. So between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is called 10 days of repentance or atonement, and that's sort of the 2-minute warning in Judaism. If your life is a book, then God keeps a book also called Sefer Chaim, the Book of Life. And throughout the year, God's writing down how you did and what you did, good, bad. On Rosh Hashanah, it is written down how you did. God makes a determination, up or down. Sounds kind of a little bit like Santa Claus. On Yom Kippur, it's sealed. So you can still change that final decision in those 10 days if you work really hard on repentance. In Judaism, we say you should repent every day because you never know when you're going to die. So it's not that we wait for Yom Kippur to clean up our mess. We're supposed to clean up our mess every day. That's why you don't hold the wages of your housekeeper overnight. You deal with it right away. Hanukkah festival celebrating the miracle. We often tell the story of this miracle of oil that lasted for 8 days. I don't want to tell you there's no Santa Claus, but there is no Santa Claus. But that's not really what the holiday is about. That story was added later because what the holiday is really about is this insurgence of, well, they turn out to be Jewish fundamentalists, and there's a whole problem there. But this insurgence of fundamentalist Jews who fought back against the Assyrian Greeks, so proto-Christian Greeks, to reclaim the temple and push these proto-Christian Greeks out of Jewish holy spaces. And they did that, and God's not mentioned in the story. So the rabbis said, well, we can't have a holiday without God, and we can't have Jews walking around celebrating their military victory. We're a minority population living in a diaspora. This will not be good for the future of our people, so let's add to the story. That's how I imagine the conversation. So that's Hanukkah, but really it's a holiday of, so we often say it's a holiday of religious freedom.
Oh.
Not really, because really what happened, it was fundamentalist Jews who were attacking assimilated Jews for being assimilated. And there's a lot of overtures to that, overlays to that, to what's going on in Israel today. Separate class. Come, we'll talk about it. Purim, we talked about. That's a hamantash, these 3 cornered cookies with jelly in the middle. All right, let's just do this. I think we talked about it last time, the proclamation of Jewish faith, the Shema, those 6 words, Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. The next sentence, or the next paragraph after that, is something called the Ve'ahavta. If you've ever seen a mezuzah on a Jewish door, the amulet that is on the doorposts of Jewish homes, inside of that is this prayer. And it says in this prayer that you should take these words and you should inscribe them on the doorposts of your house. So one thing is that's a literalist interpretation by the rabbis. It says this, so we do this. But what does the prayer say? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. So if you're a rabbi again, in the Talmudic days, how does one love God? What does it mean to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might? Are those different things? Is that poetic? Are those distinct acts? And what are those acts? There's a whole bunch of commandments just in there. Take to heart these instructions which I charge you this day, impress them upon your children, recite them when you stay at home and when you are on your way, when you lie down and when you rise up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, let them serve as a symbol before your forehead. Is that metaphorical or is that really what you do? And so we have Jews that wear these leather boxes, you might have seen pictures, called tefillin. It has this prayer inside it, same prayer that's on the mezuzah, because they read that literally. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So this is a very important prayer within Judaism. It's a quote from the Torah. It occurs in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6. And it guides a lot of Jewish practice. This idea of impressing it upon your children is probably at the root of the Jewish emphasis on education. It doesn't say teach. The Hebrew is vishinantam, to model, to actually push it upon your children, to press it into them. And that's a little different than teaching. It's part of teaching, but it's also all the other ways we teach things. So from that, we get a whole category of laws about Jewish education, or education for Jews. Questions about that? And then it goes on and talks about to put a fringe on the corner of your garments so that you remember these commandments. And so that's where we get this ritual garment of a talit. And so we have here the fringes. And in fact, if you were to add up all the twists and turns and knots of the talit, it would equal 613, which is the number of commandments. So those fringes, they serve the purpose of like a string that nobody ever actually tied around their finger to remember something, but we all saw the cartoon where somebody did. They're there because in the Bible, in the Torah, right before this commandment comes, in the book of Numbers, in the chapter before, Numbers 14, a guy goes out and cuts down a tree on the Sabbath, and Moses, with God's assent, kills him. And so they say, make a string and put it on the corner of your garment so you don't forget the commandment not to cut down trees on the Sabbath. Because when you reach for your axe, you're going to see that string and then you're going to remember. Question? I'm going to skip that one. So a few other texts. So this now comes from the Mishnah, something called Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers. So Rabbi Hillel, for whom Hillel House is named, but he didn't make a donation or anything. If I am not for myself, who is for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, then when? No matter what religion we are, we could ask those questions. A person should have 2 slips of paper which he or she carries with them at all times, one in each pocket. On one slip of paper should be written the verse, the whole world was created only for my sake. It's a verse in the Torah. On the other slip of paper should be written the verse, I am but dust and ashes. Another verse in the Torah. Both statements exist in our sacred text. The challenge is to know when to reach into one pocket and when to reach in the other. Sometimes it is not about you, and sometimes it is all about you. And how do you figure out which pocket to reach into and for how long to hold one of those things? That's the Jewish system. How to know if I'm not for myself, who will be for me, and if I'm only for myself, what am I? That's the Jewish system. That's study. That's Talmud. That's why we keep turning this and turning it over again to try to get to the truth of those wisdom statements. How does it apply in my life at this time, in the world today, in the community I live in? Skip that. And that's it. 8:55. Final questions? Comments? They're stunned. I thank you all so much for coming. You are welcome to come tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, I think we're starting. So on the holiday of Shavuot, you're supposed to study late into the night. As I said, we go to about 10:30 or so. And we're doing something with the other synagogues up and down Oak Street, and even one in North Van, or West Van, where the rabbis are going to study just one commandment from the 10, which is thou shalt not steal, and each rabbi is going to present a little something and talk about it. If that interests you, come, just listen. You don't have to have any prerequisite, you don't have to know Hebrew or anything like that. And then there's cheesecake afterwards, because there's cheesecake before. We have a little service beforehand for half an hour, then there's cheesecake, then there's the study, because we talk about Torah being like a mother's milk, and so we eat dairy on Shavuot. A lot of Jews are lactose intolerant. It's a difficult holiday for many. You're welcome to come. We'd love to have you. You're also not obligated in any way, but nobody's going to check your Jewish card at the door. You just come on in. Again, I'll offer to you, if you have any questions, you want to follow up on anything, just send me an email. I'll put this up online, or it should be on our temple website now as soon as I stop the stream, so if you want to go back over it. We have one more class next week where we're going to talk about Jewish community and institutions in Israel, and really a catch-all for any questions that you have. So please come with them if you do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.